The first forces of Napoleon's mighty army marched across the river Niemen on three pontoon bridges and landed on Russian soil at 11 p.m. on the evening of June 23, 1812. It was the start of the epic invasion of Russia. Napoleon had brought together a vast force from all around Europe for this ambitious project. That summer, over 450,000 males came into Russia. Napoleon provided his men with provisions for 3 weeks in the hopes of a swift campaign and a decisive engagement, the kind he was accustomed to. The Russians refused to comply. They retreated in a systematic manner in front of the invading force, moving farther and farther into the center of the Russian Empire. With a mix of brilliance and incredible good fortune, the Russian commanders Barclay and Bagration marched eastward, more out of necessity than choice, and managed to escape the pivotal confrontation that Napoleon so desperately envisioned. The vast numbers of imperial troops suffered greatly as a result of the speedy advance into Russia. A virtually total failure in supply and the sweltering Russian summer heat plagued Napoleon's forces. In Russia, Napoleon had achieved a few little triumphs. He encouraged his men to keep moving forward and work toward Moscow, the new objective. Following these setbacks, the Tsar gave in to the pressure and appointed the crafty Kutuzov as army commander. The Russians found themselves in a dire situation as they approached the old capital of the Tsars. They could either stand and battle the greatest captain of all time and his powerful army, or they might keep retreating and leave Moscow to the enemy. General Mikhail Kutuzov, a veteran of the Russian military, made the decision to take up defensive positions on both sides of the important roadways that connected Smolensk and Moscow. General Kutuzov positioned himself in the middle of the Russian forces and commanded the Russian force. The Russian right flank was led by General Barclay de Tolly, who was shielded from his position by a nearby river. Major earthworks supported Prince Bagration, who led the Russian army on the left, which was a more exposed position. The army of Napoleon moved in from the west. The French attack was supposed to be slowed by the Shevardino redoubt, which was in front of Prince Bagration's position. There were about 680 weapons and 130,000 troops in the Russian army overall. Napoleon's army, consisting of 130,000 troops and 580 guns, started to move in from the west on September 5th. The Shevardino battle. Thank you. The men need to relax. They're tired, sir. Go, alien. The battle starts. Alien. The Russians had lost about 6,000 troops defending the redoubt, while the French had lost about 4,000 men attempting to secure it. The two armies spent the following day getting ready for combat. French First Corps commander Marshal Davout begged Napoleon to allow him to move his troops to the south on a wide flank, but Napoleon deemed this plan too dangerous and began preparations for a huge frontal attack. At 6 a.m., the real fight started. Thank you. The weakly fortified village of Borodino came under French attack, alien. With significant losses, the French were forced to retreat. To fire on the Russian Great Redoubt, the French then moved artillery into the settlement. The main column of the French began to move forward. The Fleches came under attack from the French. They were heavily fired upon by Russian artillery as they approached the Fleches. The Poles on the right were stranded in the forest after being instructed to capture the village of Utica. As a result, the Russians could fortify the Fleches redoubt by sending additional men there. Russian fire bombarded the French as they moved closer to the Fleches. Alien. The Russians drove back the initial wave of French forces. The attack was joined by more French forces. When Polish forces eventually captured Utitsa, the Russians withdrew. Nevertheless, further Russian forces showed up and occupied the right flank alongside the fleeing Russians. Another assault on the Great Redoubt was ordered by the French. The battle starts. Thank you. The Russian artillery launched an assault. This was a setback for the company. The removal of the pledge from the battlefield had an impact. The Fleches' weary Russian infantry started to retreat. After capturing the Fleches, the French continued their advance. As their cavalry engaged the French cavalry, the Russians frantically constructed squares. The Russians were overwhelmed by the French infantry, cavalry, and artillery's unrelenting assault. There was chaos in the Russian center. Napoleon remained at the Shevardino headquarters for the majority of the day. The lengthy campaign had left him exhausted and agitated. French commanders encouraged Napoleon to use his reserves to deliver a devastating blow to the Russian force as the Russian center collapsed. Napoleon declined. A portion of Barclay's reserves were relocated to the Russian center. Napoleon increased his artillery because the French believed the Russians were getting ready for a huge counterattack. Despite their devastation, the Russians persisted. Thank you. Since the French had occupied the village of Borodino, not much had transpired there, so General Platov began his offensive. The French were in complete terror when his cavalry attacked them in the settlement. The French invasion had been delayed by 2 hours as a result. The French launched their largest attack on the Great Redoubt to date at 3 p.m. The French cavalry was able to maneuver around the side as Russian cannons targeted the French infantry that was moving forward from the front. There was additional Russian cavalry to meet them. Napoleon once more declined to commit his reserves despite pressure from French leaders. Both armies were worn out by 5 p.m. Everywhere were the injured and dead. The combat slowed as dusk drew closer.